Picture this: a forgotten farmhouse in the heart of rural America, hiding a secret so dark it's been locked away for nearly a century. When a new owner starts renovating, they uncover a bricked-off basement untouched since the 1920s. What lies behind that wall will unravel a chilling chapter of medical history that powerful families tried to bury forever. If you're obsessed with true crime and hidden mysteries, stick around. This story will leave you speechless. Let's dive into the terrifying truth uncovered in a small Ohio town. When a young entrepreneur from Dayton purchased the abandoned Carver farmstead outside Zanesville, Ohio a few years ago, the real estate agent mentioned something strange about the basement. "That section's been sealed off since the 1920s, she said, pointing to a wall of weathered bricks that looked out of place in the stone foundation. Previous owners never bothered to investigate. What he discovered behind those 94-year-old bricks would force historians to rewrite a grim chapter of Ohio's medical past, a chapter powerful families had spent nearly a century trying to erase. The truth about Dr. Elias Thornton's underground hospital during the cholera epidemic of 1828 was far more horrifying than anyone could have imagined. The discovery that would shake Zanesville's historical foundation began with the simple desire to expand a root cellar. The summer of 1828 brought more than just oppressive heat to the rolling hills of southeastern Ohio. Cholera, the dreaded Blue Death, had crept up the Ohio River from New Orleans, leaving a trail of corpses in cities like Cincinnati and Chillicothe. By July, the disease had reached Muskingum County, and the small settlement of Zanesville, barely 30 years old and home to fewer than 1,800 souls, found itself gripped by mortal terror. Dr. Elias Thornton arrived in Zanesville that fateful summer, with impeccable credentials from the University of Maryland Medical School and letters of recommendation from physicians in Baltimore. A tall, angular man with sharp blue eyes and prematurely gray hair, Thornton carried himself with the authority of Eastern medical training in a frontier town where most doctors were little more than barber surgeons or traveling patent medicine salesmen. The Grayson family had settled their 120-acre farm 4 miles northeast of Zanesville in 1795, when Ohio was still the Northwest Territory. William Grayson, a Revolutionary War veteran, had built the farmhouse with his own hands, using local limestone and timber from his land. By 1828, William had been dead for 6 years, leaving the property to his son, Daniel, a reserved man of 34 who farmed corn and raised cattle with his wife Abigail and their 4 young children. Daniel Grayson was not a man of medicine, but he possessed something Dr. Thornton desperately needed: a large, cool, isolated basement with stone walls that could be easily cleaned and multiple rooms that could house patients away from the prying eyes of Zanesville's increasingly panicked population. When Thornton approached Daniel in late July with a proposal to establish a private isolation hospital for cholera patients whose families could afford specialized care, Daniel saw an opportunity to earn desperately needed cash during lean farming years. The arrangement seemed straightforward enough. Thornton would pay Daniel $60 per month, more money than the farm generated in 4 months, to use the basement as a treatment facility for affluent patients from Zanesville and surrounding settlements. The basement's natural coolness and separation from the main house would provide ideal conditions for isolating the sick, while Thornton administered the latest medical treatments. Abigail Grayson expressed reservations about housing diseased patients beneath their home, but Daniel reminded her of their mounting debts and the promise of financial security. Thornton moved his medical equipment into the Grayson basement in early August, transforming the largest room into what he called his treatment chamber. The basement's original storage rooms became patient quarters, each fitted with a simple bed, wash basin, and chamber pot. Thornton installed oil lamps throughout the space and brought in wooden tables for his instruments and medicines. To the casual observer, it appeared to be a well-equipped, if somewhat primitive, medical facility. What the Grayson family didn't know was that Dr. Elias Thornton had been quietly dismissed from his position at Johns Hopkins Hospital 6 months earlier for irregular practices and experimental procedures not sanctioned by the medical board. Thornton's obsession with finding a cure for cholera had led him down increasingly dark paths, including unauthorized experiments on charity patients who had died under his care. His departure from Baltimore had been arranged quietly with sealed letters and hushed conversations in university corridors. The first patients arrived at the Gruesome farm on August 12, 1828. Henry Caldwell, a prosperous textile merchant, brought his 20-year-old daughter, Clara, who had begun showing the telltale signs of cholera, violent stomach cramps, explosive diarrhea, and the bluish tinge to the skin that gave the disease its terrifying nickname. Thornton assured Caldwell that Clara would receive the finest care available west of Baltimore, treatments based on the latest European medical theories that were simply unavailable in Zanesville's crude public hospital. Caldwell paid Thornton's fee of $30, nearly a year's wages for a common laborer, and departed with the promise that he could visit his daughter in 3 days. Thornton had insisted on a strict quarantine period to prevent the spread of infection, a policy that seemed both medically sound and professionally responsible. Clara Caldwell died that very night. Thornton's treatment methods, unknown to the families who entrusted their loved ones to his care, were based on a radical theory he had developed during his final months in Baltimore. Convinced that cholera was caused by an excess of corrupted humors in the blood, Thornton believed that only the most aggressive purging and bloodletting could save patients. His graduated depletion therapy involved drawing enormous quantities of blood, sometimes up to 2 quarts from a single patient, while simultaneously administering massive doses of calomel, a mercury-based compound that induced violent purging. The theory was not entirely without precedent. Bloodletting and mercury treatments were common in 1828 medical practice, but Thornton's doses were extreme, even by the standards of the day. A typical physician might draw 8 to 12 ounces of blood from a cholera patient. Thornton routinely drew 10 times that amount. Where other doctors administered calomel in grain-sized doses, Thornton's therapeutic doses contained enough mercury to poison a healthy man. Thornton kept meticulous records of his treatments, documenting each patient's response in a leather-bound journal that he stored in a locked wooden box. These records, written in Thornton's precise hand, would later provide the most damning evidence of what transpired in the Gruesome basement during those terrible months. Patient exhibits typical choleric symptoms upon admission, Thornton wrote of Clara Caldwell. Commenced graduated depletion at 2 p.m., with initial bleeding of 24 ounces. Patient's pulse weakened, but complexion improved. Administered 15 grains calomel with laudanum. Second bleeding of 20 ounces at 6 p.m. produced marked improvement in humoral balance. Patient resting comfortably. Third bleeding scheduled for midnight to complete initial purification cycle. What Thornton described as marked improvement was actually the progressive weakening of a young woman whose body was being systematically drained of its ability to fight disease. Clara Caldwell died not of cholera, but of acute blood loss and mercury poisoning, her body finally succumbing to Thornton's cure rather than the disease itself. Thornton buried Clara in a crude grave behind the farmhouse, telling Daniel Grayson that immediate burial was necessary to prevent contagion. When Henry Caldwell arrived 3 days later to visit his daughter, Thornton informed him with practiced solemnity that Clara had died peacefully in her sleep after initially responding well to treatment. The disease progressed too rapidly for even the most advanced medical intervention, Thornton explained. "I'm deeply sorry for your loss, Mr. Caldwell. I did everything medical science allowed." Caldwell, consumed by grief and grateful that his daughter had at least died under professional medical care, rather than in the overcrowded chaos of Zanesville's public hospital, paid Thornton an additional $12 for burial expenses, and departed, none the wiser. The second patient arrived on August 18, 1828. James Whitaker, a 47-year-old carpenter from nearby Dresden, whose family had pooled their savings to afford Thornton's private treatment. Whitaker lasted 4 days under Thornton's graduated depletion therapy before succumbing to the same combination of blood loss and mercury poisoning that had killed Clara Caldwell. By September, word of Thornton's private hospital had spread throughout southeastern Ohio. Desperate families, terrified by the rising death toll in public hospitals where patients were lucky to receive any treatment beyond prayer and crude palliative care, began arriving at the Gruesome farm with their life savings and their dying loved ones. Thornton's Eastern credentials and professional manner inspired confidence in people who had never encountered a university-trained physician. The basement that had once stored grain and preserves now housed a steady stream of patients who paid premium prices to die under Thornton's methodical care. Thornton had created the perfect criminal enterprise, a clientele whose desperation made them willing to pay any price, a disease whose high mortality rate made deaths unsuspicious, and an isolated location where his activities could proceed without oversight. By October 1828, Thornton had refined his operation into a grotesquely efficient system. New patients were brought to the basement through a separate entrance he had Daniel install, ostensibly to maintain quarantine protocols, but actually to limit witnesses to his activities. Thornton charged different rates based on a family's perceived wealth: $30 for merchants and professionals, $18 for skilled craftsmen, $12 for farmers with modest holdings. Thornton had also begun charging additional fees for specialized treatments and experimental therapies that he claimed were based on the latest European medical advances. Families, desperate to save their loved ones, often paid these supplemental charges without question, trusting that a university-trained physician knew best how to combat the dreaded cholera. The Gruesome family, initially grateful for the steady income Thornton provided, began to notice disturbing patterns. Despite Thornton's assurances that his advanced treatments produced superior results, every single patient brought to their basement eventually died. Abigail Grayson, whose maternal instincts were sharpened by fear for her own children's safety, began to question whether the basement was truly as safe as Thornton claimed. "It don't seem right," Abigail confided to her husband one evening in late October as they listened to the weak moaning of Thornton's latest patient drifting up through the floorboards. "All them fancy treatments, all that book learning, and still every soul dies down there. Even old Doc Ramsey in town saves one out of every 3 or 4. Daniel dismissed his wife's concerns with the practical fatalism of a farmer who had watched livestock die despite his best efforts. "Rich folks get sick same as poor folks," he told her. "Maybe they just wait too long before bringing them out here, thinking their money will buy them a miracle." What Daniel and Abigail didn't know was that Thornton had begun supplementing his income through even more sinister means. After each patient died, Thornton performed what he called post-mortem examinations to advance his understanding of cholera's effects on the human body. In reality, these examinations were crude dissections during which Thornton removed organs and tissue samples that he preserved in alcohol and sold to medical schools in Cincinnati and Columbus. The illegal trade in human anatomical specimens was a poorly kept secret in American medical education. Medical schools, desperate for cadavers to train their students, often paid handsomely for fresh specimens, few questions asked. Thornton's cholera victims, already isolated from their families and buried quickly to prevent contagion, provided perfect raw material for this gruesome commerce. Thornton's journal entries from this period reveal the cold calculation behind his activities. Patient JR expired at 3:20 a.m. following completion of depletion cycle. Immediate post-mortem examination yielded excellent specimens. Liver showing advanced choleraic deterioration. Kidney specimens suitable for preservation. Heart muscle displaying typical post-mortem changes. Total value of specimens estimated at $15. Net profit from Jenkins' case, $45 after burial and preservation expenses. The basement began to take on the characteristics of a charnel house, disguised as a medical facility. Thornton installed a large wooden table in one of the smaller rooms where he conducted his examinations, along with an array of surgical instruments and glass jars filled with preserving alcohol. The limestone walls, naturally cool and easy to clean, made perfect storage for his growing collection of anatomical specimens awaiting shipment to medical schools. Thornton's carefully constructed enterprise began to unravel in November 1828, when 2 events occurred almost simultaneously that would expose the true nature of his basement hospital. The first was the arrival of Emily Harper, the 17-year-old daughter of Reverend Joseph Harper, pastor of Zanesville's First Methodist Church. Emily had contracted cholera while caring for the sick in the church's charity hospital, and Reverend Harper, despite his modest preacher's salary, had borrowed heavily to afford Thornton's private treatment for his only child. Unlike Thornton's previous patients, Emily arrived at the Grayson basement in the very early stages of cholera, when the disease was most treatable with rest, clear fluids, and basic supportive care. She was young, strong, and otherwise healthy, exactly the type of patient who might survive even Thornton's brutal treatment regimen long enough for someone to witness what was actually happening in the basement. The second critical event was the unexpected early return of Dr. Samuel Ramsey from Columbus, where he had been attending a medical conference on cholera treatment. Dr. Ramsey, Zanesville's only other trained physician, had been curious about the reportedly excellent results Thornton was achieving with his private patients. Professional courtesy and genuine medical interest prompted Ramsey to visit the Gruesome farm on November 10, 1828, to discuss treatment methods with his colleague. What Dr. Ramsey discovered in the Gruesome basement, that cold November morning, would haunt him for the rest of his life. Ramsey arrived at the farm around 10 a.m., expecting to find Thornton conducting rounds or perhaps consulting with the Gruesome family about quarantine procedures. Instead, he found the basement entrance unlocked and descended the stone steps to investigate. The sight that greeted him in Thornton's treatment chamber defied comprehension for a man trained in legitimate medical practice. Emily Harper lay unconscious on Thornton's treatment table, her skin waxy and pale from massive blood loss. Beside the table sat 2 large basins filled with blood, and Thornton was in the process of preparing a syringe filled with what Ramsey recognized as a lethal dose of calomel. In the corner of the room, glass jars containing human organs floated in alcohol like grotesque museum specimens. "Thornton," Ramsey called out, his voice echoing in the stone chamber. "What in God's name are you doing to this child?" Thornton spun around, his blood-stained apron and wild expression making him look more like a butcher than a physician. For a moment, the 2 men stared at each other across the unconscious form of Emily Harper, the full horror of Thornton's activities hanging between them like a poison cloud. "Dr. Ramsey," Thornton said finally, his voice steady despite the circumstances. "I wasn't expecting you. Miss Harper is responding remarkably well to graduated depletion therapy. I was just preparing to administer the final dose of mercurial purification." Ramsey rushed to Emily's side, checking her pulse and examining her pupils. "This girl is dying of blood loss, not cholera," he said. "How much blood have you drawn from her?" Thornton consulted his journal with clinical detachment. 42 ounces over the past 18 hours with an additional 16 ounces scheduled for this morning's treatment. The humoral balance is nearly achieved. 42 ounces? Ramsey's voice rose in disbelief. "That's nearly 3 quarts. You've bled this child almost to death." What followed was a heated argument that could be heard throughout the farmhouse above. Thornton defended his methods with increasing desperation, citing European medical theories and his own clinical observations. Ramsey, appalled by what he was witnessing, demanded that Thornton cease treatment immediately and allow him to examine the other patients. The argument ended abruptly when Ramsey discovered that Emily Harper was Thornton's only living patient. The other beds in the basement were empty, their occupants having died under Thornton's care and been buried in the growing cemetery behind the farmhouse. "Where are your other patients?" Ramsey demanded. Thornton's response was delivered with chilling matter-of-factness. "Unfortunately, they succumbed to the advanced stages of choleric infection before my treatments could take effect. The disease is particularly virulent this season." Ramsey's medical training told him immediately that something was terribly wrong. Even during the worst cholera outbreaks, mortality rates rarely exceeded 60% with proper care. Thornton claimed to be providing the finest treatment available, yet his mortality rate appeared to be 100%. Dr. Ramsey's discovery of Thornton's activities created an impossible situation for everyone involved. Ramsey faced a moral and professional obligation to expose Thornton's deadly practices, but doing so would implicate the Gruesome family, who had provided the facility, and potentially destroy the reputations of the families who had paid for Thornton's services. In the small, tightly knit community of Muskingum County, scandal could destroy lives as surely as disease. The families who had entrusted their loved ones to Thornton were among Zanesville's most prominent citizens, merchants, craftsmen, and landowners whose social standing depended on their reputation for good judgment and moral character. To admit they had been deceived by a charlatan would bring shame that could last generations. Ramsey immediately began treating Emily Harper with fluids and rest, hoping to reverse the damage Thornton had inflicted. Meanwhile, he sent word to Reverend Harper and several other prominent citizens, requesting their immediate presence at the Gruesome farm for a matter of gravest importance regarding Dr. Thornton's medical practices. The men who gathered in the Gruesome farmhouse that afternoon represented the power structure of Zanesville society: Reverend Joseph Harper, Judge Thomas Baldwin, Merchant Edward Sterling, and banker George Merrill. Each had either entrusted family members to Thornton's care or had recommended Thornton to friends and neighbors. Ramsey's revelation of Thornton's activities hit the group like a physical blow. The respected Eastern physician they had welcomed into their community was revealed as a killer who had systematically murdered their loved ones while charging premium prices for the privilege. The basement they were standing above contained evidence of medical fraud, malpractice, and possibly deliberate murder. Thornton, cornered and facing the collapse of everything he had built, made a desperate attempt to justify his actions. He produced his journal and began reading excerpts that documented each patient's treatment, arguing that his methods were based on legitimate medical theory and that the high mortality rate was due to the severity of the cholera outbreak, not his treatment protocols. "Gentlemen," Thornton said, his voice taking on the lecturing tone of a medical school professor, "I understand your shock at witnessing advanced medical procedures. What appears extreme to untrained eyes is actually the application of the most current European medical science. Every treatment I administered was designed to save life, not take it." Judge Baldwin, whose own niece had died under Thornton's care just 2 weeks earlier, was having none of Thornton's explanations. "Dr. Thornton," he said coldly, "are you telling us that bleeding a 17-year-old girl nearly to death is accepted medical practice?" "In cases of severe humoral imbalance, yes," Thornton replied without hesitation. "The corruption must be drawn from the body before healing can begin. Miss Harper's survival will prove the effectiveness of my methods." But Emily Harper did not survive. Despite Ramsey's efforts to reverse the damage, she died that evening, her young body too weakened by Thornton's treatments to recover. Her death in the presence of witnesses finally provided the irrefutable proof that Thornton's methods were not medicine, but murder. The death of Emily Harper in front of multiple witnesses transformed Thornton from a respected physician into an obvious killer. But the group of men gathered at the Gruesome farmhouse faced a terrible dilemma: how to deal with Thornton without destroying themselves and their community in the process. A public trial would expose the full scope of Thornton's activities, revealing that Zanesville's leading citizens had been systematically deceived and their loved ones murdered. The scandal would reach far beyond Muskingum County, potentially destroying the carefully cultivated reputation of Zanesville as a civilized, well-governed community. Property values would plummet, businesses would fail, and families would be ruined by association with Thornton's crimes. Judge Baldwin, despite his personal anguish over his niece's death, recognized the broader implications of Thornton's exposure. "If this becomes public," he told the group grimly, "it will destroy not just our reputations, but our entire community. Who will do business with merchants who couldn't recognize a charlatan? Who will trust a judge who recommended a killer to his neighbors?" Reverend Harper, grief-stricken over his daughter's death but mindful of his congregation's welfare, agreed that some form of private justice might be preferable to public exposure. "The families who lost loved ones deserve to know the truth," he said. "But they also deserve to live with dignity in this community. A public trial would destroy the innocent along with the guilty." The decision was made to confront Thornton privately and demand his immediate departure from Ohio. The evidence of his crimes would be gathered and preserved, but not made public unless Thornton refused to leave voluntarily. It was a compromise that satisfied no one but seemed to offer the best chance of protecting the community from further damage. Thornton, however, refused to cooperate with the plan. Cornered and desperate, he declared that he would rather face a public trial than abandon his medical research and flee like a common criminal. He threatened to expose the complicity of the Gruesome family and other community members who had profited from his activities, claiming that any attempt to force his departure would result in scandal for everyone involved. The standoff continued through the night of November 10, 1828, with Thornton barricaded in the basement, while the community leaders debated their options in the farmhouse above. Daniel Grayson, terrified that his family would be destroyed by association with Thornton's crimes, begged the group to find a solution that would protect innocent people from the consequences of Thornton's actions. The confrontation reached its climax just before dawn on November 11, 1828, when Thornton attempted to escape through the basement's exterior entrance. Judge Baldwin and Edward Sterling, who had been watching the exit, confronted Thornton in the pre-dawn darkness behind the farmhouse. What happened next would be debated in whispers for years afterward. Thornton was found dead at sunrise, his skull crushed by what appeared to be a fall against the stone steps of the basement entrance. Judge Baldwin claimed that Thornton had slipped while trying to flee, striking his head on the limestone blocks. Edward Sterling supported this account, stating that Thornton's death was clearly accidental. Dr. Ramsey, examining Thornton's body, found evidence that suggested a more violent end than a simple fall. But faced with the choice between exposing what appeared to be vigilante justice and protecting the community from further scandal, Ramsey recorded Thornton's death as accidental trauma resulting from a fall. Thornton's death solved the immediate problem of what to do with a killer who refused to leave quietly, but it created new challenges for the community leaders, who now had to conceal not just medical fraud, but also what appeared to be murder. The basement, full of evidence, Thornton's journal, his surgical instruments, the preserved organs, and the makeshift treatment facility, had to be dealt with quickly and permanently. The decision was made to seal the basement completely, entombing all evidence of Thornton's activities and creating a permanent monument to the community's darkest secret. Daniel Grayson, desperate to distance his family from the scandal, agreed to brick up the basement entrance and never speak of what had transpired there. The official story, carefully crafted and consistently told, was that Dr. Thornton had died in an accidental fall while treating cholera patients in his private hospital. His sudden death had made it necessary to abandon and seal the basement facility to prevent the spread of infection. The patients who had died under Thornton's care were victims of the cholera epidemic, nothing more. Reverend Harper conducted a simple burial service for Thornton, attended only by the men who knew the truth about his activities. Thornton was interred in the Zanesville Cemetery with a modest headstone that identified him simply as Dr. E. Thornton, 1794 to 1828, taken by accident in service to his patients. The families who had lost loved ones under Thornton's care were quietly informed that their relatives had died of cholera despite receiving the finest medical treatment available. Most accepted this explanation, grateful to believe that their family members had died under professional care rather than in the chaos of the public hospital. Dr. Ramsey destroyed his own notes about Thornton's activities and never spoke publicly about what he had discovered in the Grayson basement. The trauma of witnessing Thornton's crimes and their violent resolution affected Ramsey deeply. He began drinking heavily and died just 3 years later, taking his knowledge of the truth to his grave. Daniel Grayson used locally quarried limestone to build a wall, sealing the basement entrance, making it appear that the space had always been separate from the main foundation. He planted ivy around the exterior entrance and allowed it to grow over the stones, creating the impression that the sealed area had been abandoned for many years. The Grayson family never spoke of their basement's dark history, even among themselves. Daniel destroyed the furniture and equipment that Thornton had brought to the farm, burning what could be burned and burying the rest in unmarked graves scattered across his property. Within a year, the only physical evidence of Thornton's activities was the sealed basement itself, hidden behind a wall of limestone and silence. The secret of the Grayson basement passed from Daniel to his son Benjamin, and from Benjamin to his son Samuel. Each generation of Graysons maintained the sealed basement as they had inherited it, understanding that opening it would resurrect a family shame too terrible to confront. The limestone wall became part of the farmhouse's foundation, so integral to the structure that later generations forgot it had ever been anything else. As decades passed, the cholera epidemic of 1828 became a distant memory, recalled only in church records and cemetery headstones. The families who had lost loved ones under Thornton's care passed down stories of relatives who had died during the terrible plague year, grateful for the care they had received from a dedicated Eastern physician who had given his own life in service to his patients. Dr. Thornton's reputation, carefully preserved by the cover-up, actually improved with time. He became remembered as a heroic figure who had brought advanced medical knowledge to the frontier and died tragically while treating the sick. Several Zanesville families named sons Elias in his honor, and the town's medical society established a small scholarship in Thornton's memory. The Grayson farm prospered over the decades, its dark secret buried beneath productive fields and growing livestock herds. Daniel lived to age 80, taking his knowledge of Thornton's crimes to his grave in 1874. Abigail died 12 years later, having never spoken of the terrible months when their basement had housed Thornton's Chamber of Horrors. By 1895, when the original witnesses to Thornton's activities had all died, the sealed basement had become simply an architectural curiosity, a space that served no purpose but was too expensive to excavate and renovate. The Great Depression forced the sale of the Gruesome farm to pay taxes and debts, ending more than a century of family ownership. The new owners, immigrants from Eastern Europe who spoke little English and cared nothing for local history, farmed the land efficiently, but took no interest in the farmhouse's peculiarities. They sealed off entire sections of the house to save on heating costs, including the area above the mysterious bricked-up basement. Through the 20th century, the Gruesome farmhouse changed hands multiple times as agriculture in southeastern Ohio gave way to suburban development and industrial activity. Each set of owners noted the sealed basement, but assumed it was the result of structural problems or water damage. No one thought to investigate what lay behind the limestone wall. When a young entrepreneur from Dayton purchased the abandoned Gruesome farmstead several years ago, he intended to renovate the 19th century farmhouse as a weekend retreat. The property's isolation and historical character appealed to him, and the price was reasonable for a house that needed extensive renovation work. He hired local contractors to update the electrical and plumbing systems, work that required access to the basement for utility installations. When the contractors encountered the bricked-up section, they initially assumed it was a failed renovation project from decades past. Building codes and insurance requirements, however, demanded that they verify the structural integrity of the sealed space before proceeding with major electrical work. On a cold morning in early spring, the new owner and his contractor began carefully removing the limestone blocks that had sealed the basement for 94 years. The mortar had hardened like concrete over the decades, requiring power tools and considerable effort to break through the barrier that Daniel Gruesome had erected in November 1828. The first indication that something was seriously wrong came from the smell. A musty, organic odor that suggested decades of stagnant air and possibly biological decay. As more stones were removed, the contractors began to see evidence of the space beyond. Wooden furniture, metal objects, and what appeared to be glass containers reflecting their flashlight beams. When the opening was finally large enough to admit a person, the new owner descended into Thornton's preserved Chamber of Horrors with a flashlight, becoming the first human being to enter the space since November 1828. What he found there would shake the foundations of local historical understanding. Thornton's treatment table still stood in the center of the main room, its wooden surface stained dark with what appeared to be dried blood. The surgical instruments Thornton had used lay scattered across smaller tables, their metal surfaces corroded but still recognizable as medical tools from the early 19th century. Glass jars that had once contained preserving alcohol lined wooden shelves, their contents long since evaporated but leaving residue that would prove significant. Most dramatically, Thornton's leather-bound journal lay open on a wooden desk, its pages yellowed and brittle but still legible after nearly 2 centuries. The precise handwriting that documented Thornton's systematic murder of his patients provided an immediately recognizable record of medical crimes that had been hidden for almost a century. The owner, recognizing the historical significance of his discovery, immediately contacted local historical authorities and archaeological experts. Within days, the sealed basement became the focus of intense investigation as historians and medical experts worked to piece together the story of what had transpired there during the cholera epidemic of 1828. The investigation of Thornton's basement laboratory revealed evidence that exceeded even the darkest suspicions about 19th century medical practice. Analysis of the preserved materials provided conclusive proof that Thornton had systematically killed his patients through deliberate medical malpractice, confirming the accounts recorded in his journal. Testing of residue found in Thornton's medicine bottles revealed mercury concentrations high enough to kill a healthy adult within hours. Bloodstains on Thornton's equipment showed evidence of multiple individuals, suggesting that the basement had been used to treat far more patients than the journal documented. Most disturbing, examination of the area behind the farmhouse revealed evidence of at least 15 human burials, indicating that Thornton's victim count exceeded even his own careful records. The historical investigation that followed the basement's discovery transformed understanding of medical practice in early Ohio and raised serious questions about how Thornton's crimes had been concealed for so long. Examination of church records, death certificates, and family documents from the 1820s revealed patterns that should have raised suspicions at the time, but apparently didn't, or were deliberately ignored. Medical historians who studied the case described Thornton's operation as one of the most systematic cases of medical murder in American frontier history, concealed by a community conspiracy that prioritized reputation over justice. The evidence suggested that Thornton had killed at least 28 people over a 4-month period, collecting fees that represented enormous sums for the time. The discovery also revealed the lengths to which prominent citizens had gone to conceal Thornton's crimes and protect their own reputations. Analysis of contemporary documents showed that the cover-up extended far beyond the immediate witnesses, involving courthouse officials who altered death records, local leaders who suppressed unfavorable stories, and religious authorities who provided false testimony about Thornton's character. Perhaps most disturbing was evidence that Thornton's activities were not entirely unique. Research prompted by the basement discovery revealed similar suspicious patterns in other Ohio communities during the same period, suggesting that medical fraud and malpractice were more common than previously understood. The isolation of frontier medical practice and the desperation of families facing epidemic disease created perfect conditions for predators like Thornton to operate with impunity. The Gruesome basement discovery forced a reassessment of how medical practice was regulated in early America and raised questions about how many other respected physicians might have been operating similar enterprises in communities across the expanding frontier. The evidence suggested that Thornton's crimes were concealed not by sophisticated criminal planning, but by the simple willingness of a community to prioritize reputation over justice for his victims. The excavation of Thornton's basement laboratory continued for months, as investigators carefully documented and preserved evidence of crimes that had been hidden for nearly 2 centuries. Local medical authorities acknowledged Thornton's crimes and the failures of oversight that had allowed them to occur. While historical societies worked to honor those who had died under his care, the investigation also revealed the human cost of the community's decision to conceal Thornton's activities rather than seek justice through legal channels. Families who had trusted Thornton with their loved ones had been deceived not only by a criminal physician, but by their own community leaders who had prioritized reputation management over truth and accountability. Analysis of remains found behind the farmhouse confirmed the identities of several victims whose families had been told they died of natural causes. The revelation that these deaths were actually murders came as a shock to descendants who had carried family stories of loss during the cholera epidemic, never suspecting that their ancestors had been victims of deliberate crimes. The Gruesome family descendants, scattered across the country over the generations since the farm's sale, expressed mixed feelings about the discovery. Some were horrified to learn that their family property had been the site of such terrible crimes, while others felt vindicated that a long-held family secret had finally been exposed. Several family members reported that they had grown up with vague stories about something bad that had happened in the basement, but no one had preserved specific knowledge of Thornton's activities. The investigation also raised troubling questions about medical practice and oversight. While systems had improved dramatically since Thornton's time, medical historians noted that isolated practice settings and vulnerable patient populations still created opportunities for abuse that might not be detected for years or decades. The farmhouse where Thornton conducted his terrible experiments has become a subject of intense historical interest. Thornton's basement laboratory was preserved exactly as it was found, providing researchers with a stark reminder of how inadequate regulation and community denial enabled systematic abuse of vulnerable people. The leather-bound journal that documented Thornton's crimes has been preserved as a primary source for understanding medical fraud in the antebellum period. Thornton's surgical instruments and preserved specimens provided evidence for studies of medical ethics and the history of physician misconduct. The property owner who uncovered this dark chapter of medical history chose historical preservation over personal renovation. The significance of Thornton's basement as evidence of systematic medical crime was deemed more important than modern convenience. The investigation sparked by the basement discovery led to similar examinations at other historical medical sites across Ohio and neighboring states. Researchers identified several other locations where suspicious patterns of patient deaths during the 1820s cholera epidemic suggested possible medical fraud or malpractice. While none yielded evidence as dramatic as Thornton's basement laboratory, the discoveries prompted a broader reassessment of medical practice regulation in early America. The families of Thornton's victims, identified through genealogical research and analysis of remains, worked to establish memorials that emphasize the importance of transparency and accountability in medical practice, values that were tragically absent during Thornton's reign of terror in the Gruesome basement. Dr. Thornton's grave in Zanesville Cemetery became a subject of controversy after the discovery of his crimes. Some descendants of his victims petitioned for his removal from the section reserved for honored community members, arguing that a murderer should not rest among those he had deceived. Others maintained that moving the grave would accomplish nothing, and that Thornton's headstone served as a reminder of how easily communities could be deceived by those who exploited professional authority. The cholera epidemic of 1828, which provided Thornton with the perfect cover for his crimes, killed thousands of people across Ohio during its peak months. Historical records suggest that Thornton was responsible for a tiny fraction of those deaths, but his systematic abuse of trust and deliberate murder of patients seeking help represents one of the darkest chapters in American medical history. Medical ethicists who studied Thornton's case identified several factors that enabled his crimes: the isolation of rural medical practice, the desperation of families facing epidemic disease, the lack of effective medical licensing and oversight, and most critically, a community's willingness to prioritize reputation over justice when confronted with evidence of systematic abuse. The discovery in the Gruesome basement raises questions that extend far beyond the specific crimes of Dr. Elias Thornton. How many other physicians in early America operated similar enterprises, using epidemic disease as cover for systematic fraud and murder? How many communities chose to conceal evidence of medical crimes rather than face the scandal of exposure? How many families carried false stories of heroic medical care, never knowing that their loved ones had actually been murdered by the very people they trusted to provide healing? The limestone wall that concealed Thornton's crimes for 94 years stands as a monument to the power of collective denial and the lengths to which communities will go to protect their reputations. But it also demonstrates the persistence of truth and the inevitable consequences of trying to bury evidence of systematic abuse rather than confronting it honestly. Thornton's journal, with its meticulous documentation of medical murder disguised as treatment, provides a chilling reminder that the most dangerous predators are often those who operate behind facades of respectability and professional authority. His victims trusted him not in spite of his credentials, but because of them, making their betrayal even more profound and his crimes even more inexcusable. The basement that once housed Thornton's Chamber of Horrors now serves as a reminder where researchers and the public can learn about the importance of oversight, transparency, and accountability in healthcare. The preservation of this dark history serves not to sensationalize past crimes, but to prevent future ones by maintaining awareness of how easily trust can be betrayed and how quickly healing can become harm when proper safeguards are absent. Perhaps the most important lesson from Thornton's basement is that silence in the face of evidence never truly conceals crime. It only delays justice and multiplies harm. The community leaders who chose to seal Thornton's laboratory, rather than expose his crimes, thought they were protecting their neighbors from scandal and shame. Instead, they created a deeper shame that could only be resolved when the truth finally emerged nearly 2 centuries later. The discovery in Thornton's basement laboratory confronted investigators with the scene of crimes that shocked even experienced historians. The experience was deliberately preserved to remind future generations of what can happen when medical authority is abused and communities choose denial over accountability. Historical studies emphasize that Thornton's crimes were not the product of primitive 19th century medicine, but of deliberate choices made by an individual who used his professional authority to exploit vulnerable people. Medical practice, while improved in terms of regulation and oversight, still requires constant vigilance to prevent similar abuses from occurring. This chilling tale of Dr. Elias Thornton's basement of horrors is just one of many dark secrets hiding in America's past. If this story gave you goosebumps, share it with a friend who loves a good mystery. Drop a comment below and tell us what you think. Could there be other hidden laboratories waiting to be uncovered? Hit that like button, subscribe, and ring the notification bell to join us as we dig into more shocking stories from history. Until next time, keep exploring the shadows of the past.